Ruby Bishop arrived at the Harlan Creek cattle outfit on the first Tuesday of April in 1878, with a bedroll on her back, $32 in her boot, and the kind of quiet fury in her eyes that made men either step aside or make the worst mistake of their lives. The foreman, a barrel-chested man named Clyde Dutton, took one long look at her standing in the doorway of the main barn and laughed. Not a short laugh. A full, rolling, belly laugh that brought three of his cowboys out from behind their horses to see what was so funny. Ruby stood there and let him finish. She had heard the laugh before. She had heard it in Abilene when she asked the stockyard man for work. She had heard it in Dodge City when she walked into the livery and offered her services as a hand. She had let every single one of those men laugh, and then she had moved on and found the next door and knocked on it until somebody opened it without laughing first. "You are looking for the seamstress in town, I expect," Clyde Dutton said, wiping his eyes. "Or maybe the laundry house. They are 2 blocks north if you take the main road." "I am looking for the cattle drive going north to Caldwell," Ruby said. Her voice was level. "I was told you are short 4 hands after the Morrison brothers got themselves jailed in Hayes, and after Tommy Ricks broke his arm falling off a wagon on the road from Wichita. That leaves you 3 short counting the man who quit last week over pay, which I heard about from a man named Ike Hadley at the feed store this morning." Clyde Dutton stopped smiling. He looked at the men behind him, who looked at each other. Ruby reached into the inner pocket of her canvas coat and pulled out a folded letter, which she held out without moving from where she stood. One of the younger cowboys, a boy of maybe 19 with a sunburned nose, walked over and took it, bringing it back to Clyde. Clyde unfolded it and read it slowly. His expression changed in stages, the way sky changes before a storm. "Thomas Hargreave wrote this," he said. "He did. He ran the Circle H outfit out of South Texas for 11 years. I worked 2 full drives for him, the 75 drive and the 76 drive. Before that I worked horses on his ranch for 2 years. He can verify every word if you have the means to reach him by wire." "Women don't do trail drives," Clyde said. But his voice had lost its certainty. The letter was clearly genuine, and Thomas Hargreave was a name that carried weight in cattle country. "This one does," Ruby said. August Keller was sitting on the top rail of the corral on the far side of the barn when all of this happened. He had been watching the exchange from that distance, far enough away that he could not hear every word clearly but close enough to read the body language. He was the trail boss on the Harlan Creek drive, which meant the decision was ultimately his, not Clyde Dutton's, a fact that Clyde sometimes forgot and August rarely needed to remind him of. He was 28 years old and had been running cattle north since he was 22, and in that time he had developed a talent for reading people that he valued more than almost any other skill he possessed. He watched the woman hand the letter over without flinching. He watched her stand still while Clyde read it. He watched her face, which was sunburned like the face of somebody who spent their days outside, and he noted the calluses on her hands even from that distance because he knew how to look for them, the thickness of the fingers, the toughness of the palm when a person reached for something. He watched her boots, which were proper working boots, worn down in the right places, resoled at least once. He looked at her horse tied to the post outside the barn, a solid dun mare, well kept, good hooves, a horse that somebody had taken care of over a long period of time. Climbed down from the rail and walked over. "I am August Keller," he said when he reached them. "I run this drive." Ruby looked at him directly. "Ruby Bishop, out of San Antonio by way of the Circle H and a few other places." "I read the letter," he said, which was not true since Clyde was still holding it, but it communicated that he did not need to because he had already made some kind of assessment. "Can you ride night watch?" "Yes." "Can you work a cutting horse in rough country?" "Yes." "Can you cook if the cook gets sick?" She paused half a second. "I can cook well enough that nobody starves." He almost smiled. "Almost. We leave Thursday morning before sunup. Pay is $30 a month, same as the other hands. We go 400 and some miles to Caldwell, and we do not stop for anything except weather and water and legitimate trouble. You will have the same work and the same expectations as every man on the crew, and if you cannot keep up, I will send you back without argument and without additional pay for days worked." "That is fair," Ruby said. "There are 8 men on this crew, not counting you and me. Some of them are going to be unhappy about this arrangement. I expect that. Are you going to be a problem about it?" Her jaw tightened just slightly. "I am not the one who will be the problem." August studied her for another moment, then nodded and turned to Clyde. "Get her set up with a bedroll assignment and show her where the remuda is. She can take her pick of the 3 browns we have not assigned yet." He walked away after that. He did not look back. Ruby Bishop watched him go and said nothing, and Clyde Dutton looked at the letter in his hand, and then at the space where August had been, and shook his head like a man who had just witnessed something he was not sure how to categorize. The drive began on a gray Thursday morning with low clouds and the smell of rain somewhere to the northwest. 840 longhorn cattle, collected from 4 different ranches across the surrounding counties, were moved out of the holding pen and onto the trail north before the sun had properly risen. They moved like a river, slow and immense, their horns catching what little light there was, their hooves raising a steady column of dust even in the damp air. Ruby took her position on the right flank without being told. She had worked enough drives to know the rhythm of a cattle drive the way some people know the rhythm of a song they have heard their whole lives. You watched the edge of your section. You read the animals nearest to you, their ears, their speed, the angle of their bodies relative to the herd. You pushed gently and consistently, and you corrected early, before a small drift became a bigger drift and then a real problem. She knew these things not because somebody had sat her down and taught them to her in sequence, but because she had learned them one at a time through hard experience, through mistakes made and corrected and made again until they stopped being mistakes. The man riding next to her on the right flank for the first 2 days was a long-jawed Texan named Pete Combe, who said nothing to her for the first 4 hours and then said, loudly enough for the man behind him to hear, "I did not sign on to work beside a woman. It is not proper." "You signed on to work beside whoever August Keller put on this flank," Ruby said pleasantly. "If you have a complaint about the staffing decisions, I suggest you take it up with him." Pete Combe said nothing else on the subject. He was 26 and had come up from East Texas, and he was not a cruel man, just a man who had inherited a set of opinions about how the world was organized and had not yet been given sufficient cause to examine them. Over the next 3 days, without any additional conversation about it, he began to watch what Ruby did and how she did it, and he found that he had nothing specific to complain about in terms of the work itself. August Keller rode the full line twice a day in those first days, up one side and down the other, checking his flankers and his point riders and his drag men, looking at the herd and the ground and the sky in that particular way he had of looking at things, taking everything in without appearing to look at anything specifically. When he came past Ruby on the right flank, he slowed his horse and watched her work for a few minutes before moving on. He did this both times. He did not speak to her. He just watched. She knew he was watching. She did not change anything about what she was doing. On the 4th day out, they hit a river crossing. The Cimarron was running high from the spring rains, not dangerously so, but high enough to require attention. The cattle did not want to go in. They bunched at the bank, the lead animals pressing back against the herd, the whole mass of them becoming a tightly packed and increasingly agitated problem. August sent 2-point riders in first to show the cattle the crossing was possible. The cattle watched. Some moved forward. Most did not. Then one of the young steers on the right edge of the herd turned and began pushing back against the current of movement. And within 30 seconds there was the beginning of a serious mill on the right side, which was Ruby's side. She moved before anyone called for her to move, cutting her horse into the gap between the turning steer and the animals behind him, angling the dun mare sideways to block the backward movement, and applying just enough pressure to redirect the steer without panicking him. It was a piece of horsemanship that required genuine skill, the kind of precise, quiet, confident work that either worked or made things dramatically worse depending on the quality of the rider. It worked. The steer turned back toward the river. The mill stopped. 3 other animals that had been following the steer's lead shifted back with him, and the right side of the herd settled. August watched this from the opposite bank where he had crossed first to direct the cattle's landing. He watched the whole sequence. He watched how she had seen the problem coming before most of the men on her side had noticed it, how she had moved with efficiency and without excess, how she had used her horse correctly. He watched the way she sat after, checking the right flank to make sure the correction held, her eyes moving along the edge of the herd with the steady attention of someone who knew that one problem solved did not mean the next one was not already forming. He said nothing. He turned his horse and rode up the far bank to check the landing conditions. They made camp that night on the north side of the Cimarron on a flat piece of ground with good grass and a bend in the river that blocked the worst of the wind. The cook, a weathered older man named Francis who everybody called Frank, had beans and salt pork ready by the time the cattle were settled and the horses were checked. The men ate in the way trail hands ate, quickly and with focus, because eating was not a social occasion on a drive so much as a maintenance activity, like oiling a saddle. You put in what your body needed, and you either talked or you did not. Ruby ate apart from most of the men, not dramatically, just slightly to one side where there was a piece of flat rock that served as a good seat, and she ate her beans and looked at the stars coming out over the prairie, which were extraordinary out here where there was no town light to diminish them. She was thinking about the right flank and the 3 steers at the back that had shown some restlessness all afternoon, and she was thinking about whether the weather was going to stay clear, and she was also, in a quieter part of her mind, thinking about how tired her hips were from the long day in the saddle because she had been on a horse for 14 hours, and her body knew it even if she would not say so. August Keller walked over and sat down on the end of the same rock without asking permission. He had his tin cup of coffee and he sat in silence for a moment, looking at the same piece of sky she was looking at. "The river crossing today," he said. "Yes," she said. "The right flank." "Caught it early. It was coming. Most of the men on that side did not see it until after you had already corrected it." She turned to look at him. His face in the firelight was serious and thoughtful, not a handsome face exactly, but a face with good lines, a strong jaw and steady eyes, the kind of face that communicated that the person wearing it thought carefully before speaking. He was looking at the stars still. "I have been doing this for a while," she said. "I know. Hargreaves' letter was specific." He paused. "I almost did not hire you. I know that too. It was not about the work. I believed you could do the work." She waited. "It is the other men," he said. "Not what they might do to you. More that some of them are going to make your life difficult and I have to run a smooth drive, and those 2 things do not always coexist." "Has there been trouble so far?" she asked. "No," he said. "Then let's see how far that goes before we worry about it." He finally looked at her. In the firelight his eyes were very dark brown or dark green. She could not be certain which in that light. They stayed on her face for a moment longer than a purely professional conversation required, and then he looked away. "The 3 steers at the back of the right section," he said. "I want them moved up by morning. Put them in the middle of the herd where they will have company and calm down." She was startled for just a second that he had noticed the same 3 she had been watching all afternoon. "I was going to suggest the same. Do it first thing before we move out." He stood, finishing his coffee. "You did good work today, Ruby Bishop." It was the first time he had used her name, and she noticed, though she made sure that noticing it did not show on her face. He walked back to the main fire and she watched him go, and then looked back up at the stars and thought about the fact that she had been doing this work for 3 years, and in all of that time, no trail boss had ever sat down beside her at camp and said she had done good work. Thomas Hargreave had been decent and fair to her, but his idea of approval was the absence of criticism. That was enough. She had learned not to need more than that. But August Keller saying it in that quiet, direct way sitting on the same rock, looking at the same sky, had done something to the simple mechanics of her chest that she was not entirely prepared for. She filed it away. She had a drive to finish. The drive moved through its second week with the grinding consistency of trail work, which was to say that every day was both the same and completely different from the one before. The same in that you rose before the sun and worked the same animals across the same flat grass toward the same distant destination. Different in that the land changed under you constantly, the grass going from short to tall and back, the ground going from firm to soft and back, the weather arriving without warning and departing the same way. On the 9th day, there was a lightning storm that came up from the south in the late afternoon, the kind of storm that every cattle drive feared because longhorns in lightning were liable to run, and running cattle at dusk in prairie grass were a disaster waiting to place itself somewhere permanent in the memory of anyone who survived it. The sky went dark in the west with a speed that was almost theatrical, and then the first lightning came in sheets, and the cattle felt it in their bones before the sound did anything. August called all hands without ceremony, just a sharp whistle and a hand signal that everyone on the drive knew meant every available rider on the herd now. Ruby was already moving when the signal came. The dun mare felt the electricity in the air and wanted to be nervous about it, and Ruby spoke quietly to her in a steady stream of words that were not commands exactly, but were a kind of communication, a reassurance offered in complete sentences, and the mare responded by staying collected under her even as the world began to shake with sound. The herd shifted. Not a full run, not yet, but the dangerous restlessness that came before a run, the whole mass of animals moving with a tight, vibrating energy that was looking for a direction to point itself. August was on the left side of the herd near the front, trying to hold the lead animals in a circle rather than letting them straighten out and build speed. Pete Combe and 2 other riders were on the right near the front. Ruby went to the back left, which was the most exposed position because it was farthest from the main control effort and closest to where the storm was coming from. 3 steers at the back left broke away in the first 10 minutes. They went straight south, back into the storm, which was counterintuitive but not uncommon. Ruby went after them without hesitation. The dun mare stretched out into a full run in the dark prairie, with lightning behind them and the grass whipping in the wind, and Ruby bent low over the mare's neck and guided her with her knees and the lightest touch on the reins, because in this light, and at this speed, you trusted your horse, or you did not trust anyone. She came alongside the lead steer in the darkness, the lightning giving her strobed images of his position and the ground to the left of him, and she angled the mare into him, not contact, just presence, the sheer warm weight of horse and rider occupying the space that told the steer his direction was not available. He turned. The other 2 turned with him. She brought all 3 back in a wide arc, letting them run out some of their fear before redirecting them toward the herd, and by the time she got them back, the main body of the cattle was still circling and not running, and the storm was beginning to move off to the east, its worst energy spent. August found her at the edge of the herd after the animals were settled. The rain that had come in the storm's wake was steady and cold, and everyone was soaked. "The 3 that broke south," he said. "Brought them back," she said. He looked at her. She was wet to the bone, her hair dark with rain, her face shining with it. Her voice was the same as it always was. "Anyone hurt?" she asked. "No, you." "No." He nodded and turned his horse. Then he stopped. "I want you on point tomorrow," he said. Point was the most important position on the drive. It was where the trail boss or his most trusted rider worked, at the very front of the herd, guiding the lead cattle in the right direction, setting the pace. It was not given to someone on their 9th day on a drive unless the trail boss had formed a definitive opinion about their ability. Ruby sat on her horse in the rain and said, "All right." He rode away, and she let out a long, slow breath and patted the mare's wet neck. The other men were less pleased about the point assignment than Ruby was. Over the next 2 days, there was a low current of complaint moving through the camp. audible if you positioned yourself near the right conversations. Pete Combe was largely neutral at this point, having decided through direct observation that Ruby Bishop could work. But a man named Dan Furlow, who was 33, and had expected the point position himself after the second point rider developed a bad blister on his foot that made riding difficult, was not neutral at all. Dan Furlow did not say anything to Ruby directly. He said things near her, the kind of observations that were aimed at her but phrased as general commentary. Things like strange world when the natural order of things gets turned around, and some men get sensitive when the wrong person is put in front of them. He said these things at the camp fire in the evenings, and a few men laughed and a few did not, and Ruby heard every word and continued eating her food, or tending her tack, or doing whatever she had been doing before the comment landed. On the third evening of this particular pattern, August came and sat beside Ruby again at the rock she preferred at the edge of camp. He did not bring up Dan Furlow specifically. "How are you finding point?" he asked. "Natural," she said. Which was the exact right word, not arrogant, not false modest, just accurate. "The herd moves well with you up there. The lead animals have settled in the last 2 days. They like a steady pace. I think the previous point rider was rushing them in the mornings. They were agitated before noon every day." He considered this. "I noticed that. I thought it was the weather. Some of it was the weather, but some of it was the pace." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Furlow." She did not react. "I am aware of it," he said. "I want you to know that. I do not need you to manage it for me," she said, and her voice was even but her meaning was clear. She had been managing this kind of thing since she was 17 years old, and she did not intend to start needing rescue from it now. He looked at her. "I know you do not need me to, but I am going to address it anyway because it is bad for the drive, and the drive is my responsibility." She looked back at him. "Then address it because it is bad for the drive, not because you are concerned about my feelings." "Can it not be both?" he said. The words came out quietly, and there was something in them that was slightly different from his usual tone, which was thoughtful and measured but kept itself professionally contained. There was something slightly less contained in those 4 words, and they both felt it, she in the way her breath caught almost imperceptibly, and he in the way he looked at the fire rather than at her for a moment after saying it. "It can be both," she said after a moment, quietly. The next morning, August Keller pulled Dan Furlow off his horse at the start of the day's ride and had a conversation with him that lasted approximately 4 minutes and that no one else heard directly. Dan Furlow mounted back up and rode his assigned position on the left flank and said nothing to or near Ruby Bishop for the remainder of the drive. The other men who had been participating in the general commentary took their cues from this and went equally quiet. It did not make Ruby suddenly popular, but it made the camp functional, and functional was what August had promised her it would be. What changed in the following days was harder to name than the cessation of Dan Furlow's commentary. It was something in the quality of the drive itself, the way the work had settled into a rhythm that felt, to anyone paying attention, like a piece of machinery that had finally found its correct calibration. Ruby at point read the land ahead with a competence that translated directly into smoother daily movements. She saw water before the herd smelled it and knew when to let them move toward it and when to hold them back. She saw the quality of grass from a distance and made route decisions that August confirmed with his own reading of the terrain. She worked 14 hours a day without complaint and was not the first to sleep and was the first to rise in the morning. The men watched this, the ones who had not been watching before. Pete Combe had been watching from nearly the beginning, and his original resistance had shifted into something closer to respect. A younger hand named Will Torres, who was 20, and from a Mexican ranching family in South Texas, and who had a quiet, observational personality that reminded Ruby a little of herself, began deferring to her judgments about the herd's behavior in the way that experienced hands defer to whoever is most consistently right. August watched all of it. He watched her work with the accumulated attention of someone cataloging something important, and he rode the drive and checked his crew and managed the logistics of moving a large herd across difficult country. And he did not speak to Ruby about anything personal. He spoke to her about the drive, about the cattle, about the route decisions and the weather and the condition of the animals. He spoke to her the way he spoke to any good hand whose judgment he trusted, directly and with the implicit respect of taking her answers seriously. But at camp in the evenings, he found himself on the rock at the edge of camp more often than was strictly necessary, and she was there more often than coincidence could account for, and they talked about the drive and then beyond the drive. She told him about the Circle H, about Thomas Hargreave, who was a difficult man in many ways but a fair one, and about what it had taken to convince him she was worth hiring. She told him about the drives she had done, the cattle, the country, the things she had learned. She told him about the lightning storm on the 76 drive that had cost 3 men and 200 cattle, and that she had survived by luck and by the grace of a good horse. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father's farm, about coming west at 19 with a friend who was now dead from fever in New Mexico, about the first drive he had run as a junior hand for a man named Willis, and how he had made every mistake a person could make in the first 2 weeks, and how Willis had sat down with him one evening and told him, without kindness and without cruelty, exactly what each mistake had been and how to avoid it. He said that conversation had been more valuable than anything else in his professional life, and he had tried to apply its lessons to how he ran his own crews. "Is that what you did with me?" she asked one evening. "The first night at this rock, was that you telling me what I needed to correct?" He thought about it genuinely, which was something she had come to appreciate about him, that he actually thought about questions before answering them rather than simply producing the first available response. "No," he said, "that was something else." "What was it?" He looked at her. The fire was low and the stars were very bright, and the prairie stretched out around them in all directions, enormous and indifferent, and somehow also intimate in the way that enormous spaces can be when shared with the right person. "I am not entirely sure," he said, "but I know it was something else." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked at the stars, and there was the beginning of something between them that was fragile and important, and neither of them was ready to say anything definitive about yet. On the 17th day of the drive, there was trouble of a different kind. A group of men, 4 of them, appeared on a ridge to the west around mid-morning and paced the herd for almost 2 hours before descending to meet the drive at a low spot in the terrain. They were neither lawmen, nor Indians, nor anyone who could be easily categorized. They were the kind of men who existed in the spaces between towns and law, who had learned that a cattle drive moving through open country was a vulnerable thing, and that vulnerability could be converted to profit. Their leader was a wide man with a red beard who introduced himself as Gallant, which was probably not his name. He told August, who met him at the front of the drive while the herd came to a stop behind them, that this was his land they were crossing, and there would be a fee for the privilege, stated in the casual tone of someone who considered the outcome of this conversation already decided. August told him, equally calmly, that the drive was on public land that was verifiable by any county survey, and that there was no fee to be paid. He said this while his eyes moved over the 4 men and their horses and the ridge behind them, counting and assessing in the way he did everything. The conversation went back and forth, neither side raising its voice, both sides understanding what was actually being negotiated beneath the polite language of it. Gallant eventually moved his horse slightly to the side, and his hand moved toward his belt in a gesture that was meant to communicate serious intent. And at that moment, without any instruction from August, Ruby came up on the right side of August's horse with her rifle already in her hands, resting across her saddle, pointed in the approximate direction of Gallant and his men. Will Torres came up on the left with his hand on his own rifle. Pete Combe appeared behind Gallant's group from the right flank, where he had quietly circled during the conversation. Gallant looked at the configuration and reevaluated his arithmetic. "We will find another road," he said, which was not a road they had been talking about, and the four of them rode back up to the ridge and over it and did not return. August turned his horse and looked at Ruby and Will and Pete without saying anything for a moment. Then he said, "Let's move the herd." That night at camp, when the fire was lower and most of the men were settling towards sleep, August came to the rock at the edge of camp and sat down. He said nothing for a long time. The prairie was quiet except for the distant sounds of the cattle and the ordinary small sounds of a sleeping camp. "Today," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "You moved up without being told." The situation called for it. It did. He was quiet again. "Ruby," she looked at him. It was the first time he had used only her first name. He looked back at her, and in the firelight his face was doing something she had not quite seen it do before. The careful, measured expression he normally kept was slightly different, slightly more open, the way a door looks different when it has been moved just a few degrees from its usual position. "I have been on 14 drives," he said. "And I have not once had a hand like you." She waited. "I don't mean the work," he said, though it was clear the work was part of it. "I mean the whole of it, the way you see things, the way you are." She was quiet for a moment. The stars were enormous above them. Somewhere in the herd one of the cattle made a low sound and then was quiet again. "August," she said. He looked at her. "What are you saying?" she asked. Her voice was direct because she was a direct person and because she believed that indirect conversations about important things were a waste of time that both parties could not afford. He turned fully toward her on the rock. They were close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes in the firelight, which was dark green. She had finally confirmed this, dark green with a ring of darker color at the edge. "I am saying," he said, "that I think about you when I am not talking to you. I am saying that I have been trying not to for a good while now because it seemed like a complication that neither of us needed, and because you have made it clear that you are here to do a job and that the job is what matters." "The job does matter," she said. "I know. But you are saying it is not all that matters." "I am saying that, yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. The prairie breathed its enormous quiet breath all around them. "I think about you when I am not talking to you too," she said. "I have been trying not to for the same reasons." He reached out in his hand, which was calloused and capable, and which she had watched work horses and rope, and write the logistics of the drive in his notebook with the same focused competence, closed over hers where it rested on the rock between them. He held it without further movement, not pulling her toward him, just holding. The way you hold something you are not entirely certain is yours to hold, yet carefully, without assumption. She turned her hand over so that their palms were together. They sat like that for a long while, not kissing, not speaking, just sitting together at the edge of the camp with the enormous stars above them and 840 cattle sleeping around them, and the fire burning down toward its coals. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was something Ruby Bishop had not allowed herself to want in a long time, and she was aware of its weight and its sweetness simultaneously, the way you are aware of those things when you have been careful not to want them. When she went to her bedroll that night, she lay on her back and looked at the canvas of the sky and thought about his hand holding hers and the way he had said her first name, just her first name. And she thought about the drive and the remaining distance to Caldwell and the cattle and the work that still needed doing. And she thought about all of it at once without needing to separate any of it from any other part of it. Because it was all the same life, the work and the feeling. And she had always known that was how she wanted it to be. The last 2 weeks of the drive north to Caldwell brought new country and new challenges. The terrain changed as they moved north and east, the flat open grassland giving way to rolling hills and creek crossings that required more attention, the grass getting better, and the water getting more reliable, but the trail itself becoming less clearly defined. August pushed the daily mileage up slightly as they got closer to Caldwell. wanting to arrive before the main surge of other drives that would crowd the market and potentially reduce their price. Ruby and August did not change anything obvious about how they operated during the drive. She rode point. He rode the full line. They consulted about route and cattle and weather as they had been doing. But in the evenings at camp, if you were paying attention, you could see the small difference. The way he positioned himself at meals so that he could see her. The way she tilted slightly in his direction when they were consulting about the day's route. The way they both went to the rock at the edge of camp in the evenings without making a plan to do so. The way the conversation moved more easily, with more warmth, with the particular fluency of two people who have passed some internal threshold with each other and now know they are on the same side of it. Pete Combe noticed. He was not a subtle man, but he was a perceptive one, and one evening he said to Will Torres while they were both tending their horses, "Well, I'll be interested to see how that goes." Will Torres, who had noticed the same thing several days earlier, just nodded and went on with his brushing. Dan Furlow, who was still keeping his distance from Ruby in accordance with his conversation with August, noticed too. To his credit, he kept whatever he thought about it entirely to himself. On the 20th day, Ruby's mare went lame. It happened mid-morning on a creek crossing, a bad step on a slick underwater rock, and by the time they reached the other bank the mare was favoring her left front leg with the kind of determination that meant the tenderness was real and not just a momentary reaction. Ruby pulled up and dismounted, running her hands down the leg with the focused attention of someone who knew what she was looking for, and found the swelling starting just above the fetlock. She stood up and looked at August, who had come back along the line when he saw her stopped. "How bad?" he said. "She needs rest, 3 days minimum." She looked at the mare with something that was not sentimental but was deeply felt nonetheless. "I have had this horse 4 years." August looked at the mare and then at Ruby. "We have 2 spare horses in the remuda, the bay and the gray. The gray is better for point work." "I know the gray," she said. "I have watched her. Take the gray. Your mare can travel in the remuda string for now. We will keep the pace easy enough that she can manage it." She looked at him. He had not hesitated, had not suggested she take a lesser position or a lighter day's work. He had just solved the problem in the direction that kept her in her position and also kept the mare safe. "Thank you," she said. "Get on the gray," he said simply, and rode back up to the front. She bridled the gray with her own tack and mounted up, and they moved on, and the drive went forward, and her mare walked quietly in the remuda string for 3 days before the swelling reduced enough that Ruby started riding her again gently alongside the gray, alternating horses across the day's miles. They reached Caldwell on a Wednesday morning in late May, coming in from the south with the dust of their passage rising behind them, and the town appearing on the horizon as a line of buildings that gradually organized themselves into streets and corrals, and the particular busy noise of a cattle market town at the height of its season. The Harlan Creek cattle were moved into holding pens with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from a crew that has been working together long enough to need very few spoken instructions. Ruby moved cattle into pens and confirmed counts and checked animals for the condition statements they would need for the sale. And she did this work alongside the men who had started the drive 3 weeks and some days ago with varying degrees of hostility or indifference toward her, and who had arrived at this moment, most of them, at something considerably warmer. Pete Combe actually shook her hand when the cattle were counted in and the pens were secured. He did it without preamble, just put his hand out, and when she took it, he shook it firmly. "Good drive," he said. He meant it as more than a comment about the drive. "Good drive," she said. She meant the same. Will Torres grinned at her with the wide, unguarded grin of a young man who was happy about how things had gone and did not feel the need to dress that happiness up in anything more restrained. "I want to work another drive with you, Miss Bishop," he said. "I learned more watching you these 4 weeks than I did in 2 seasons before." She was genuinely touched. She did not let it show more than a slight softening around her eyes, but it was there. "I learned some things from you too, tours," she said, which was also true. August handled the business side of the arrival efficiently, meeting with the buyers and reviewing the cattle quality documentation, and negotiating the final price with the focus of someone who had done this many times and knew exactly how to do it. He got a good price, better than expected, because the herd was in notably good condition for the miles they had come, well fed and properly paced, and without the injuries and losses that sometimes reduced a drive's final value. The crew was paid that evening. $30 a month for approximately 30 days meant every hand received $30, and Ruby took her $30 and put it with the 32 that were still in her boot and thought about what she was going to do next. She was sitting outside the stable where she had arranged for her mare to spend a few days in good care while the leg finished healing, sitting on a fence rail and watching the town go about its evening business, when August came and stood beside her. Not sat. Stood, which was different, which communicated that he had something to say that required more than the usual casual posture of the evening rock at camp. "The Harlan Creek outfit wants me to run another drive in August," he said, "going south first to pick up a new gather and then north to Abilene. It is a bigger drive, 1,200 head." She looked at him. "Is this you asking if I will come on the next drive? It is a part of what I am saying, yes." "What is the other part?" He turned and faced her directly. August Keller was not a man who did things with flourish. He was a man who did things with precision, and the precision he was applying now was of the kind reserved for the most important things, the things you only say once and that you want to say without error. "The other part," he said, "is that I do not want to spend the time between drives not knowing where you are." She looked at him steadily. "That is a notable thing to say." "It is." He paused. "I have thought about it carefully. I imagine you have." "I am not a man with a great deal to offer in terms of comfort and permanence," he said. "I run cattle drives. I am on the trail more months than I am off it. I have a small property in Missouri that I visit twice a year, which is more of a fact than a home at this point. I am not offering you a settled life." "I do not want a settled life," she said. "Or at least not the kind of settled life that most people seem to mean when they say settled." She paused. "What are you offering, August?" He was quiet for a moment. "Everything I have," he said, "which is not grand but it is honest." She sat on the fence rail and looked at him, this serious, careful, competent man who had watched her work for 30 days and had seen her clearly and had said so, first in small ways and then in the big way at the rock at the edge of camp, and who was now standing in front of her in the dusty evening light of Caldwell, Kansas, in May of 1878, offering her everything he had. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "The first morning you rode past me on the right flank. You slowed down and watched me work and then rode on. What did you think?" He considered this. "I thought you were the best flanker I had seen in 3 years, and I thought I was probably going to spend the rest of the drive trying not to think about you, which was inconvenient." She almost laughed. She controlled it but just barely, and what came out was a smile, a real one, not the small, careful one she gave to situations, but an actual smile, which changed her face in the way real smiles change faces, making them suddenly younger and warmer and wholly themselves. "All right, August Keller," she said. "All right what?" "All right, yes." He looked at her. "Yes to the drive, yes to everything," she said. "Yes to the drive and yes to you, and yes to not spending time between drives not knowing where the other one is. Yes to all of it." He reached up and took her hand where it rested on the fence rail. He held it the way he had held it at camp, carefully and without assumption, except now they were past assumptions. They were on the other side of them entirely. Then he did something he had not done before. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the back of it. Not a showy gesture, just a quiet one, definitive and warm. "We should probably discuss the details," he said. "Yes," she said, "we should." But she was still smiling, and his hand was still holding hers, and the details could wait a few more minutes. They were married in Caldwell before the end of May, in the office of the local judge, who had done this particular piece of official business for a remarkable range of people over his years on the bench, and who did it for August and Ruby with the same professional warmth he brought to every occasion. Will Torres stood as witness. Pete Combe came and stood at the back of the room, because nobody had specifically told him not to, and nobody told him to leave. Frank the cook, who had developed a quiet fondness for Ruby over the course of the drive, had baked something approximating a cake using the limited resources available to him and brought it to the small gathering afterward. Ruby wore her cleanest shirt, which was still a working shirt, and August wore his better jacket, which was the one he saved for business meetings, and they stood in front of the judge and said the words that the moment required and signed the necessary documents, and it was not a ceremony of particular grandeur, but it was theirs, and it was real, and both of them were the kind of people for whom real mattered more than grand. That evening they sat together in the small room August had taken at the boarding house, the window open to the warm May air, and talked for a long time about the things you talk about when you are figuring out what a shared life looks like. The August drive, the Missouri property, the question of what home meant for two people who had both been in motion so long that home was more of a concept than a fixed location. "I want to see the Missouri place," she said. "Properly. I want to know what we are working with." "It needs work," he said. "I have worked a cattle drive. I can manage a house that needs work. It is more than needing some paint. The back pasture fence is down, and the well needs attention, and the roof on the north side of the barn is questionable. Then we will fix those things," she said. "In the off-season, between drives." He looked at her with something in his eyes that was both warm and slightly wondering, as if he was still in the process of believing that this was the actual shape of his life now. This person beside him who looked at everything he considered a problem and saw instead a project. "You are remarkably practical for a romantic situation," he said. "Is this a romantic situation?" she asked. Her tone was dry, but her eyes were warm. "I believe it is. I have limited experience with them, but I believe that is what this qualifies as." She leaned forward and kissed him, because he deserved kissing in that moment, and because she wanted to, and he kissed her back with all the precise, focused attention he brought to everything he did, which turned out to be quite a lot of attention, and the conversation about the Missouri property and the fence and the well paused for a considerable time. The summer drive in August was everything the spring drive had been and more. 1,200 head was a different scale of animal management, requiring more hands and more coordination, and more of the particular kind of sustained attention that distinguished good trail work from merely adequate trail work. August brought on 6 new hands in addition to the core crew, and Will Torres came back, and Pete Combe came back, and even Frank came back for the cooking. Ruby rode point again, and this time there was no period of adjustment. She was point from the first morning, and the new hands who had not seen her work before watched her work and drew their own conclusions, which were on the whole accurate ones. There was one new hand, a man named Cross who was 30 and had strong opinions about the organization of things, who took about a week to arrive at a functional opinion of her, during which time August had a conversation with him that followed the same general shape as the earlier conversation with Dan Furlow. After that, Cross rode his flank position and did his work and kept his opinions to himself, and by the 3rd week, he was watching her route decisions at point the way the others watched them, with the attention of someone learning from a better practitioner. The Abilene drive took 38 days, and they arrived in good order with minimal losses, and cattle in better condition than the June market had seen from other drives that season, which August had anticipated and planned for, and which translated into a price that made the Harlan Creek outfit significantly happier with their trail boss than they had been the previous year. They were paid on a Thursday afternoon in early September, 1878, standing in the cattle buyer's office while the figures were confirmed, and the payment was made, and afterward August took Ruby to the best restaurant in Abilene, which was a real restaurant with tablecloths and an actual menu. the kind of place she had walked past and not into for most of her adult life. And they ate a real meal sitting across from each other at a table, which was such a different experience from every camp meal they had ever shared that it was almost strange and also wonderful. "What do you want?" he asked her over dinner, not about the food or not only about the food. She looked at him across the table. "I want to see the Missouri property. I want to fix the fence and the well and the barn roof. I want to do the spring drive next year and the summer drive the year after that." She paused. "I want to have a life that is real. I have always wanted that." "And children?" he asked. His voice was careful but not shy. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Eventually, do you?" "Yes," he said. "Eventually seems like the right word." They left for Missouri in the third week of September, which gave them the fall and the early winter to work on the property before the cold made outdoor work impractical. The property was about what August had described, a farmhouse that needed several kinds of attention and a barn that needed more, and a piece of land that was genuinely good, with the kind of soil that responded enthusiastically to care, and the kind of grass in the back pasture that, once the fence was repaired, would support animals very comfortably. Ruby worked on it with the same energy she brought to everything. She was not a woman who did things by half measures. She learned quickly what the property needed, and she applied herself to learning what she did not know, whether that meant watching August work the carpentry on the barn roof, or reading the almanac for information about the soil, or talking to the neighbor woman 2 miles down the road, a Mrs. Alina Greer who was 50 and sharp, and had farmed this particular stretch of Missouri for 20 years, and who had opinions about everything and knowledge to support them. Mrs. Greer took an immediate liking to Ruby, which surprised neither of them for long because they were both direct people who said what they meant and appreciated the same quality in others. Over the fall and winter, Ruby developed a friendship with Alina Greer that was one of the first genuine female friendships she had had in her adult life, having spent most of that life in the company of working men on cattle drives. It turned out she was excellent at friendship when the opportunity presented itself. The property took its shape over that fall and winter. The fence went up around the back pasture. The well was cleaned, and its mechanism repaired with the help of a man from town who knew the specific kind of well repair they needed. The barn roof was properly addressed by the end of October. The farmhouse was painted on the outside and replastered in 2 rooms on the inside, and Ruby hung curtains she made herself, simple ones, not decorative ones, the kind that blocked early morning light rather than displayed any particular aesthetic sensibility. August watched her organize their house with the same quality of attention he had brought to watching her work the drive. He thought about this sometimes, the similarity of the observation, the same woman making the same kinds of precise, competent decisions in a different context, and the results being equally impressive and equally her own. In December, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the barn because she had realized it that morning while she was feeding the horses, and she had not wanted to wait until she came inside and the barn was where he was. She said it directly, the way she said most things. "I am pregnant," and then watched his face. He was up on the second rail of the nearest stall when she said it, checking the roof repair from the inside. He stopped checking the roof and looked down at her. Then he climbed down off the rail and came to where she stood and put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her for a long moment in the quiet winter light of the barn, with the horses moving in their stalls and the cold pressing against the barn walls and the smell of hay and horses around them. Then he kissed her forehead and then her mouth and held her against him in the particular way he had of holding her that she had come to think of as the most specific comfort she had ever been offered by any person in her life. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you feeling all right?" "I feel fine," she said. "I felt sick in the morning for about a week, but I thought I had eaten something questionable." He laughed a little at that, the slightly surprised laugh of a person who has just processed a significant piece of information and whose body is expressing the emotion through the available channel. "Ruby, August, we are going to have a child. We are, she agreed. He held her for a while longer and then he said, "Come inside, it is cold." And they went inside and she made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about it, practically and warmly, in the way they talked about most things. He was born in late July of 1879, a boy they named Eli James Keller, and he was the kind of baby who arrived in the world with strong opinions about it, which was a character trait he appeared to have inherited from both sides of his parentage in equal measure. He was born in the farmhouse with Mrs. Greer and a local midwife in attendance, and August was in the kitchen being useless in the particular way that men of the era were instructed to be during childbirth, pacing and drinking coffee, and listening to every sound from the other room with the focused anxiety of a man whose competence in all other areas had utterly abandoned him. When Mrs. Greer came out and told him he could come in, he walked through the door and saw Ruby sitting up in the bed with the baby in her arms, and she looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, one that combined exhaustion and fierceness, and a kind of profound wonder that the fierceness made more rather than less moving. And he walked to the bed, and sat on the edge of it, and looked at Eli James Keller, who was small and red-faced, and already clearly disgruntled about the general situation. "He is perfect," August said. "He is very loud," Ruby said. "He has been expressing strong opinions since the moment he arrived." "He gets that from you," August said. She looked at him. "He gets that from both of us," she said. And August, looking at the firm set of the infant's tiny jaw, conceded that she was probably right. The summer drive of 1879 was managed without August, who remained with Ruby and the new baby through the season. He had arranged for another trail boss to run the Harlan Creek drive, which the outfit was not entirely happy about but accepted given the circumstances. This was a significant financial sacrifice, and he made it without complaint, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to be present for the months after Eli arrived, because he had thought about this before the baby came and had decided it was what he wanted. Ruby appreciated this more than she said directly, which is to say she appreciated it enormously and expressed it in the way she expressed most important things, through action. She made the farm work in that year more productive than it had been in years before, applying to the land the same systematic attention she applied to everything else, and by autumn they had a property that was genuinely thriving. Eli grew in the way healthy babies grow, through stages that seemed impossible and then happened, and the farmhouse that had been quiet and slightly bare when they first arrived gradually became something different, something warmer, inhabited by three people who were figuring out together what family meant when none of them had had a particularly steady experience of it before. In the spring of 1880, when Eli was 9 months old and Ruby had been feeling the pull of the trail again with increasing urgency, they had a conversation about the future of the drives. August had agreed to run the Harlan Creek spring drive and would be gone for the better part of 2 months. Ruby would stay with Eli, which she accepted without resentment but not without the acknowledgement of what it cost her. "Next year," he said, "we work it out differently. We find a way for you to come." "With a child to consider, that is complicated," she said. "It is, but complicated things can be worked out." He looked at her. "I do not want you grounded here indefinitely just because we have a child. That is not what either of us signed up for." She looked at him for a moment. "Mrs. Greer has offered," she said. "She said if we needed someone to stay with Eli for a period, she would do it. Is that something you would consider?" "I am considering it," she said. He would be safe with a leaner, and a month is not forever. "No," he said, "it is not." And so the following spring in 1881, with Eli at nearly 2 years old and a leaner Greer settled into the farmhouse with him, Ruby Bishop Keller rode out on the spring drive with her husband. She did not ride point this time. They shared the position, alternating by the day, which was a management structure neither of them had tried before and which worked better than most new ideas did, because both of them were good enough at the work to make it work. Will Torres was there again, now 23 and considerably more skilled than the 20-year-old who had ridden his first full drive with her, and Pete Combe came for one last drive before settling the ranch land he had been saving for in West Texas. There were new hands, too, young men who came onto this drive with no previous ideas about Ruby Bishop Keller, and who simply experienced her as the trail boss's wife who rode point on alternating days, and whose judgment about the cattle and the route was the one that the trail boss consistently deferred to when they disagreed, which told you everything you needed to know. The 1881 drive went north to Abilene again across 34 days of hard, variable, beautiful country, and they arrived in September with the herd in excellent condition, and the crew intact and the season's work done. Ruby stood at the edge of the Abilene stockyards while the cattle went into the pens and watched the count come in and felt the satisfaction of completed work, which was one of the best feelings she knew, and she felt it standing beside August, who was watching the same count come in with the same expression, and she put her hand through his arm and he covered it with his, and they stood like that until the count was done. They went home to Missouri in October. Eli was talking in full sentences by then, which he had apparently been doing for several weeks, and he had strong preferences about his food and his toys and the order in which things happened, and he had a particular attachment to the barn cats that Mrs. Greer had not been entirely able to manage, resulting in a situation where there were currently 2 barn cats who considered themselves indoor cats and who occupied the kitchen with a confidence that was remarkable in animals of their size. Eleanor Greer, who had stayed in the farmhouse for the 3 months they were away, was clearly both exhausted and deeply fond of Eli, which was the correct combination of responses to Eli at 2 years old. She had kept detailed notes of things he had done and said, which she presented to Ruby with the air of a person delivering an important document, and Ruby read through them at the kitchen table while Eli climbed on August's back in the next room and demanded that August be a horse. In the early spring of 1882, Ruby discovered she was pregnant again. She told August in the barn again, because that was apparently where this kind of information presented itself to her, and he came down off whatever he was examining and held her with the same warmth he had brought to the first announcement, though this time also with more practical competence, knowing what the months ahead would look like and having his feelings about it more organized before she finished the sentence. The second child was born in November of 1882, and this time it was a girl, and they named her Clara Ruth Keller. Clara was quieter than Eli had been as an infant, which was not the same as easy. It just meant the strong opinions were expressed through a different frequency. She had Ruby's eyes, which were light brown with a warmth in them that August had noticed the very first day and that he had continued to notice every day since. And when he looked at his daughter's face in those first weeks and saw those eyes looking back at him, he felt the particular version of undone that his children could produce in him with no effort at all. Eli was 3.5 when Clara arrived and took to the role of older brother with a proprietary enthusiasm that required some management. He had his father's focused watchfulness, which in a 3-year-old was both charming and occasionally overwhelming. The years moved the way good years do, with a fullness that is only visible when you look back at them from a slight distance. They continued the drives, August and sometimes Ruby, the pattern shifting based on the children's ages and Eleanor Greer's availability and the specific demands of each season. Ruby developed the farm in the off-seasons with the same energy she had always brought to the trail. The back pasture became a genuine working pasture with a small cattle operation of their own, nothing like the scale of the drives, but a real and productive thing. And she ran it with the expertise she had built over years of working other people's animals. Will Torres came through Missouri in the summer of 1883 on his way to a ranch job in Colorado and spent 3 days with them, sleeping in the barn loft and playing with Eli with the patient good humor of a young man who had grown into himself well, And when he left, he shook August's hand and turned to Ruby and said, without any awkwardness about it, "You changed how I think about the work. I want you to know that." Ruby said, "You did good work, Tors. You always did." He rode out and she watched him go and felt something that was warm and a little sad, the way good endings always are. Pete Combs sent a letter from West Texas in 1884 to say he had his ranch and it was going, and he had married a woman named Dorothy in the spring, and that Dorothy had said to tell August and Ruby hello, which meant Pete had talked about them to his wife, which meant they occupied some part of his sense of himself and the life he had come from, which Ruby found quietly moving. In the fall of 1884, they made a decision together, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, the way they made most decisions, directly and with full examination of the relevant factors. August was 34. Ruby was 30. They had been married for 6 years. The drives were beginning to become less reliable as the cattle industry changed, as the railroads pushed further into the cattle country and the drives got shorter and the economics shifted, as they always shifted, toward the next thing. The Harlan Creek outfit is talking about switching to rail transport for the next season, August said. They are not the only ones. The long drives are ending. Ruby looked at the table. She had known this was coming, had been watching the signs of it for 2 years. The drives were still happening, but the handwriting was on the wall, as the saying went, and she could read handwriting. "So what does the next thing look like?" she said. "The property," he said. "Expand the cattle operation here. We have the land and we know the work. We could build something real." "Yes," she said immediately, because she had been thinking the same thing. "And I have been offered something else," he said. "The county is looking for someone to manage the public grazing land coordination. It is a different kind of work, but it uses the same knowledge. Route management, animal condition, land assessment. I would be here more." She looked at him. "Is that what you want, to be here more?" He looked at her across the kitchen table with the same dark green eyes that had been watching her for 6 years, first from a corral rail and then from the trail and then from across every kind of terrain and weather and human difficulty they had moved through together. "Yes," he said, "it is what I want." "Then do both," she said. "Expand the operation here and take the county position. I will run the property when you are in the county seat." He almost smiled. Almost. The almost smile she had come to love as specifically his, the one that meant he was genuinely amused and was containing it by about 30%. "Of course you will," he said. "Do you have doubts about that?" she said. "Not a single one," he said. "In 6 years I have not had a single doubt about what you are capable of. I gave that up early." She stood up from the table and came around to his side and sat in the chair beside him and leaned against his shoulder, which was something she did sometimes in the evenings when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, just leaned against him with the comfortable assurance of a person who knows exactly where she is and exactly where she belongs. He put his arm around her. "August," she said, "yes, we have built something real." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the farmhouse, the Missouri autumn was moving through its dark and quiet hours. The land settled in the way land settles when it has been properly cared for. The children were asleep down the hall. The barn cats, who were still indoor cats and had been joined by a third who had arrived and made the same claim on the kitchen with the same confidence, were somewhere in the house in the dark. The back pasture with its good fence held their small cattle operation calmly. "We have," he said. "We have built something very real." She stayed where she was against his shoulder, and he kept his arm around her, and they sat in the kitchen of the farmhouse they had fixed together in the first years of their marriage, and thought about the drives they had run and the country they had covered, and the work they had done side by side across all the varied terrain of the years. And they thought about the children in the next rooms and the land outside, and the life that had been built out of 2 people who had come to each other in the dust and noise of a cattle drive in the spring of 1878, and recognized in each other something that was worth the risk of everything they had. In the spring of 1885, Ruby Bishop Keller discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. She had by now abandoned the barn as the location for this particular kind of announcement and told August at the kitchen table over morning coffee, which was both more practical and more dignified. He put down his cup and looked at her and said, "Are you happy about it?" She said, "Yes." "Are you?" He said, "Yes," and poured her more coffee, which was the specific and correct response. The third child was born in November of 1885 and was a boy they named Thomas William Keller. Thomas for Thomas Hargreave, who had given Ruby her first professional opportunity in the cattle business, and whose recommendations had made everything else possible, and William for Will Torres because he had been there at the beginning, and because they had both been fond of him, and because it seemed right. Thomas was a different baby than either Eli or Clara, calmer and more watchful, with a stillness that reminded Ruby of something she recognized, but took several weeks to name. When she named it, she told August, and he looked at the baby for a long time and then looked at her and said quietly, "He watches." And she said, "He does. He watches everything." The same way, she did not say aloud, but both of them knew that August had watched her on the right flank of the Harlan Creek spring drive in April of 1878. Eli was 6 when Thomas was born and Clara was 3, and the farmhouse, which had once been a quiet property needing paint and carpentry, was now a household with 3 children and 3 barn cats, and a working cattle operation in the back pasture, and a man who spent several days a month at the county seat, coordinating grazing land, and a woman who ran all of it when he was gone and half of it when he was there, and who was, at 31, the most competent and alive version of herself she had ever been. Eleanor Greer came by for Sunday dinners with a regularity that had made her functionally part of the family, and she and Ruby sat at the kitchen table in the evenings sometimes and talked about the property and the children, and about the world as it was changing around them. The railroads coming in, the open range being fenced, the old trail driving life that was ending as a way of organizing the cattle industry, and about what was permanent underneath those changes, which was the land and the work and the relationships built in the course of doing things that mattered. In 1886, August was offered the formal position of County Agricultural Director, which was a job that had never existed in that county before, and that the county commissioners had essentially created in response to the reality that someone of August Keller's experience and judgment was available, and that it would be foolish not to use it. He took the position after talking it through with Ruby across 2 evenings at the kitchen table, and the result was a life that was rooted in a specific place, in a way that neither of them had experienced before, but that fit them better than they had expected anything fixed to fit people who had lived in motion. Ruby expanded the cattle operation on the property to 20 head, which was the right scale for what she could manage while also managing the house and the children and the 100 other demands of a working farm. She kept meticulous records of the animals and their condition and their output, the same way she had kept track of cattle on the drives, and the operation turned a modest profit by its 2nd year that she reinvested in better stock and better equipment. She was also teaching. Not formally, not in a schoolhouse, but in the way that competent people teach through action and availability. Eli was 7 and already following her around the farm with the focused interest of a child who wanted to understand how things worked, and she explained as she went. The same things she had explained to herself during her years of learning, the animals, the land, the logic of it. She taught him to read the cattle the way August had never explicitly taught her to read them but had modeled in the doing, through the quality of his own attention. Clara at 5 was a different kind of learner, less interested in the cattle and more interested in the horses, which was a preference Ruby understood perfectly. And she began teaching Clara to ride properly at 5, sitting her on the dun mare who was now 10 years old and gray around the muzzle, and so steady under a small child that it was almost as if the mare had decided this was her final purpose and was committing to it entirely. Thomas at 1 was not yet teachable about anything specific, but was learning everything by watching, which everyone in the family had come to accept as his characteristic way of being in the world. The years after 1886 settled into a shape that was rich with the specific texture of a life well made. August came home from the county seat on Thursday evenings and stayed through Monday mornings. And in those days, the farmhouse was full in a particular way. All three children circling him with the concentrated attention that children give to a beloved parent who has been briefly absent. Ruby watched this and felt in it a satisfaction that was different from the satisfaction of completed trail work, quieter and more layered, and no less complete. They argued sometimes, the way people who are honest with each other argue, about real things, about the property decisions and the children's education, and the question of whether to expand the cattle operation further or keep it at its current manageable scale. They argued the way they talked, directly and without retreat, and they resolved things the same way, by examining the actual factors and arriving at the most defensible conclusion, which sometimes was her position, and sometimes was his, and sometimes was a third thing that neither of them had articulated before the argument began. Ruby Bishop Keller at 35 was someone who had found the life she had been building toward without knowing its exact shape. The life where the work and the person were integrated rather than opposed, where being capable and being loved were not in tension. Where the woman who had arrived in the doorway of the Harlan Creek barn with $32 in her boot, and a letter from Thomas Hargreave, and the quiet fury of someone who had been told no too many times, was the same woman as the one who stood in the back pasture of a working Missouri farm, and read the condition of her cattle, and knew exactly what she had, and what she had built, and who had built it with her. August Keller at 37 ran his county position with the same careful competence he had run his drives, and he came home on Thursday evenings and sat at the kitchen table with his wife, and talked about the week and the county and the farm and the children, and the way the land was doing, and everything else that made up the full substance of a shared life. He had watched Ruby Bishop outwork every man on a cattle drive in the spring of 1878, and he had said nothing until camp. And then, at camp, he had sat down beside her on a flat rock at the edge of a fire, and he had said something. And then he had said more, and what he had been saying since then, in all the ways available to him, was that he had known from the moment he came off the corral rail and walked over to where she stood in the barn doorway that she was the most significant person he would ever meet, and that everything that had happened since had confirmed it in every detail. On a warm evening in October of 1887, with Eli at 8 doing his lessons at the kitchen table and Clara at 5 asleep already, and Thomas at 2 playing with the barn cats on the kitchen floor in the particular focused way he played with everything, August came home from the county seat a day early, and Ruby looked up from the salt pork she was cutting and saw his face and set down the knife. "What is it?" she said. He came and sat at the kitchen table across from where she had been standing. Eli glanced up from his lessons and assessed the situation, and went back to his letters with the unusual tact of a child who has learned to read rooms. "The county commission wants to expand the agricultural program," August said. "They are talking about bringing in a formal agricultural advisor from Kansas City, someone with formal training. And," she said, "and I told them I thought we should consider the local expertise first, that there are people in this county who have forgotten more about cattle management and land assessment than most formally trained advisors have learned yet." She looked at him. "August, I am not suggesting anything you would not want. I am telling you that the position would be advisory, it would be part-time, it would be paid, and it would use everything you know." She looked at Eli at his letters. She looked at the kitchen where Thomas was conducting negotiations with a barn cat over a piece of yarn. She looked at August, who was watching her with the same focused, complete attention he had always given to her, from the corral rail to this kitchen table. "What would it require?" she said. 2 days in the county seat per month, consultation with the larger landholders in the district, assessment reports, The same kind of systematic observation you have always done but formalized. While running the farm, he confirmed, I would be here on those 2 days. We would overlap with Eliner's availability for the children. She was quiet for a moment. Eli turned a page. Thomas convinced the cat to release the yarn. The kitchen smelled like salt pork in October and home. Tell the commission yes, she said. He did. The position was formalized in the early winter of 1887, and Ruby Bishop Keller became the first woman in the county to hold an official agricultural advisory role, a fact that the county commission mentioned in careful language that acknowledged the unusual nature of the appointment without making more of it than it was, and that the larger landholders in the district responded to with a range of reactions that ranged from enthusiastic to deeply uncertain. The uncertain ones came around. She was consistent with them, showing up when she said she would show up and knowing what she said she knew, and not trying to manage anyone's feelings about who she was or what she knew, just doing the work and letting the work speak for itself, which had always been her method and had always worked eventually. By 1889, the position was not unusual any longer. It was just part of how the county operated. Ruby Keller came once a month and assessed the land and the cattle, and produced her reports, and the reports were accurate and useful, and the landholders in the district valued them. And the question of whether she should be doing this had been replaced by the simpler question of what her assessment would be this month. Eli Keller turned 10 in July of 1889 and had decided he was going to be a veterinarian when he grew up, a profession he had read about in a magazine from St. Louis that had come through the county seat with one of August's correspondence packets. Ruby had read the article with him, and they had discussed it at the kitchen table for an hour, the way it worked, and what it would require, and whether it was a viable ambition for a boy growing up on a Missouri farm. And she had told him that it was viable if he worked for it, and that working for things was the only reliable method she had found for achieving them. Clara at 7 was already what anyone would have called a horsewoman, possessing a quality of rapport with the horses that was specific and unusual, and that both August and Ruby recognized as something to be cultivated rather than managed. She spent hours in the barn that her parents let her spend because they knew what it meant when a child found the thing that was theirs. Thomas at 4 was still watching everything. He was the quietest Keller child and in some ways the most interesting one to watch, because he would sit very still and observe a situation, and then, when he chose to act or speak, he would do so with such precision that it was slightly startling. One evening in the fall of 1889, August came home to find Ruby sitting on the back porch in the last light of the day, her legs up on the rail, looking at the back pasture where the cattle were settled in the good grass behind the good fence they had fixed in their first year here. She had her coffee, and she was looking at the pasture and the sky above it, which was doing spectacular things with the sunset colors. He sat beside her and put his legs up on the same rail and looked at the same sky. After a while she said, "Do you remember what I said in Caldwell when you asked me what I wanted? You said you wanted to see the Missouri place and fix the fence and the well and the barn roof," he said, "and you wanted to do the spring drive and the summer drive, and you wanted a life that was real." She turned to look at him. She was always a little surprised when he remembered things exactly, though she should have stopped being surprised by it years ago. "Yes," she said. "Do you have it?" he said. "Is it what you wanted?" She looked at the pasture and the sky, and then at the barn where Clara was still spending her after-dinner hour with the horses, and at the kitchen window through which she could see Eli at his lessons, and at the door behind which Thomas was presumably being quietly and observationally himself. She looked at August beside her, this man who had come down off a fence rail and changed the shape of her life, who had said her name at camp one evening and meant something by it, who had offered everything he had and meant that too. "It is more than what I wanted," she said, "because I did not know how to want this specifically. I only knew I wanted something real." He reached over and covered her hand on the porch rail with his, the same gesture he had made on the rock at the edge of a trail camp 11 years ago, and she turned her hand over so their palms were together, the same response she had made then. The sky continued its performance above the Missouri land that they had fixed and farmed and made their own, and the cattle settled in the good grass. And inside the house, 3 children who were fully and specifically themselves moved through their evening activities. And Ruby Bishop Keller sat beside her husband on the back porch and held his hand and understood, with the clarity that comes from having worked very hard for a very long time towards something that mattered, that she was exactly where she had always been trying to get to, and that she had gotten there in the company of the right person, and that the whole of it, from the doorway of the Harlan Creek barn to this porch railing, from the $32 in her boot to the property that now represented genuine prosperity, from the woman who had stood alone in front of a laughing foreman to the woman who held an official advisory position in the county she had made her home, all of it had been exactly what a real life looked like when it was lived by someone who had refused to accept anything less. The sun went down over Missouri, and the stars began, enormous and bright the way they were out here where there was still space enough to see them properly. And August Keller sat beside Ruby Bishop Keller in the October dark, and they watched the stars come out the same way they had watched them come out over the Kansas prairie on the first night. He had sat beside her on the flat rock at the edge of camp, and the distance between that night and this one was full of everything that a life contains. The work and the weather and the children and the grief and the difficulty and the extraordinary, sustained, daily joy of being the kind of people who find each other and know it and do not let go. He said her name in the dark, just her name. She said his, and that was everything there was to say, and it was more than enough, and it was real.